The ocean was still that morning, as if it hadn't yet decided to bear witness to what was coming. Mist rolled low across the water, the horizon blurred in shades of gray and ash. Beneath my boots, the steel deck of the USS Iowa vibrated faintly with restrained power, like a predator waiting for its signal to strike. I raised my binoculars toward the black island ahead, 8 square miles of volcanic rock carved by the Japanese into a fortress they believed unbreakable. Iwo Jima, just a shape at first, distant and silent, but every officer on the bridge knew the truth. Underneath that silence were 22,000 enemy soldiers, dug into tunnels and reinforced caverns, waiting. I'd spent months at sea, but nothing felt like this morning. Not the cold, not the gray. Not the weight in the air. The fleet had gathered in full strength, Missouri to starboard, Wisconsin to port, older battleships stretched in formation like a row of steel hammers ready to fall. Behind them, cruisers and destroyers formed a protective arc. Overhead, reconnaissance planes circled like hawks. Admiral Spruance's words had been brief: crush every gun before the Marines land. He didn't need to say more. We all understood. The more we broke here, the more boys would make it home. I turned toward the chart table. Captain McCree was already there, sleeves rolled, voice steady as he reviewed the fire plan with navigation. The air smelled of diesel, salt, and coffee, ordinary scents, moments before something extraordinary. "Morrison," McCree called without looking up.
"Yes, sir. Turret 2 status."
"Ready in all respects," I answered. My clipboard bore the numbers like scripture: 9 guns, 2,700-pound shells, target range 18,000 yards. Below, the giant turret rotated toward the island with an almost serene grace, as if unaware of the violence it carried within. The Iowa's 3 main turrets housed the largest naval rifles ever mounted on an American ship. When all 9 fired, the ship itself shifted sideways in the water. A sailor beside me crossed himself. No one mocked him. The sun had barely begun to rise when the loudspeaker crackled. "All stations, stand by for fire mission." The mist seemed to tighten around us. I pressed my binoculars against my face. For a heartbeat, I saw nothing but smoke and shadow. 700 hours. The flag bridge gave the order. "Commence firing." The world split open. A column of flame roared from the barrels, bright, violent, beautiful. A heartbeat later, the deck heaved under my boots as 9 16-inch shells tore through the air at nearly twice the speed of sound. 25 seconds after leaving the Iowa, they struck. The island didn't just shake, it convulsed. Through my binoculars, I saw geysers of ash, coral, and steel erupt into the morning sky. Japanese bunkers that had taken months to build disappeared in an instant, swallowed by a storm of fire and stone. I lowered the binoculars slowly. "Impact confirmed," I said softly, though no one had asked. Around me, men were already moving, adjusting bearings, logging trajectories, coordinating with spotting aircraft. This was only the beginning. The fire plan was a work of brutal elegance. Each battleship had its assigned grid, and every gun crew moved like part of a single, enormous machine. The target, fortifications, artillery pits, communication hubs, nothing left to chance. The precision of the operation struck me even more than the firepower. 10 years earlier, no navy in the world could have done this, hit from miles away with such surgical accuracy. Now, we could erase a bunker the size of a house without ever seeing the men inside. I gripped the bridge railing. My gloves smelled of metal and cordite. "Fire control, turret 1 reports loaded."
"Turret 3 ready."
"Bearing locked." The second salvo went out like a drumbeat from some great machine god. A curtain of smoke rolled over the deck. Cups rattled in the mess 3 decks below, and out on that volcanic island, the earth bloomed black. I could imagine what it must have felt like for the men huddled in their bunkers. Not fear, something deeper. The sound alone was a kind of terror that sank into bone. Rodriguez, one of the young loaders, once told me, "Sir, when those guns fire, it's like the world inhales." He wasn't wrong. The operation unfolded in quiet coordination. Spotter planes above radioed back adjustments. Crews below loaded the next round without needing to be told. Nobody spoke about the men on the other side of the water, but we all thought about them in some small way. Iwo Jima was more than a military objective, it was a warning. The Japanese had spent months turning it into an island fortress. Every hill a bunker, every cave a gun, a place meant to bleed us dry if we dared land.
But they had never faced the Iowa.
The sky lightened as the first hour of bombardment passed. Smoke now hung over the island like a shroud, and the once clear outlines of fortifications were gone. Where they'd stood, there were only craters, some as wide as a house, some as deep as a two-story building. We'd fired dozens of shells already, and the day was young. I glanced at McCree. He didn't look triumphant. He looked like a man carrying the weight of something heavy. "We'll keep hitting them until they have nothing left to fight with," he said quietly. "Yes, sir," I replied. Around us the fleet thundered in rhythm. Missouri joined the chorus, then Wisconsin, then the older battleships. A wall of steel spoke in one voice, and the island shook with every syllable. As the sun climbed, the bridge filled with heat and the smell of burnt powder. The mist was gone now, replaced by smoke columns so tall they merged with the clouds. I adjusted the focus on my binoculars. The landscape no longer looked like an island, it looked like the moon. A young sailor exhaled slowly beside me. "Sir, it's like we're unbuilding it." He was right. What had taken the enemy months to fortify, we were reducing in minutes. And still something inside me whispered a quiet, unwelcome thought. This is only the beginning. The real storm hasn't even come ashore yet. By the second hour, the deck-no Ellinger startled with each shot. It breathed with the guns. The sound was a constant pulse through the ship's spine, a rhythm as precise as a metronome, as merciless as a storm. The men no longer flinched when the Iowa's 9 16-inch rifles roared. They moved in unison with them. Every 90 seconds, a turret somewhere on this ship coughed out a piece of steel heavier than a truck. Each shell carried enough explosive to flatten a building. The Japanese had built a fortress on Iwo Jima. We were dismantling it one heartbeat at a time. I walked down from the bridge to the gun deck to feel it up close. The sound there wasn't a sound anymore, it was pressure. When the breech locked, when the rammer hissed forward, when that shell slid home, it was like standing next to a god clearing its throat. Rodriguez, sweat streaking down his face despite the February chill, threw me a quick grin. "You picked a good time to visit, sir." I leaned close to make myself heard over the mechanical thunder. "You boys keeping up?" "Yes, sir. Feels like the whole Pacific's riding these barrels." His arms were blackened with soot, his shirt plastered to his skin. This was what power looked like up close, not polished steel or distant thunder, but men straining against heat, pressure, and weight. Above, the intercom snapped. "Turret 2, fire mission, grid 2207. The crew moved before the words were done. 8 men practiced wordless, powder bags loaded, breech sealed, elevation adjusted. "Fire!" The recoil slammed through the deck like a sledgehammer against bone, a flash of orange, a cloud of smoke. For a second, the world vanished in sound. 25 seconds later, the island erupted again, another bunker erased from existence. I climbed back to the bridge. McCree stood at the plotting table, listening as fire control relayed corrections. Spotter planes circled overhead, giving us a god's-eye view of the battlefield below. Their voices crackled through the radio. "Iowa, this is Spotter 1. Artillery battery spotted at coordinates 2740. Recommend immediate suppression." I took the handset. "Spotter 1, Iowa copies. Stand by for steel rain." We didn't need to discuss it. Everyone on that bridge knew their part in this deadly choreography. I relayed the coordinates to Turret 2. The barrels tilted slightly upward, like a predator sniffing the wind. The next salvo struck that artillery battery like a hammer on glass. Even from this distance, we saw the plume of smoke rise sharp and black. "Direct hit," Spotter 1 confirmed, his voice cutting through static. "Battery neutralized." I glanced at the young communications officer, Anderson. He was 22 and handled the fire control system like he'd been born with it. His eyes never left the analog calculator in front of him, a labyrinth of dials, switches, and gears. 10 years ago, no machine like this existed. Now it made death precise. "Range correction locked, sir," Anderson said. "Fire again," I replied. "Let's finish it." And the guns spoke once more. The fleet was in full chorus now. Missouri opened up to our starboard side, her own 16-inch guns sending orange fire across the sea. To port, Wisconsin joined in. Then the older battleships, Arkansas, Texas, New York, Tennessee, their 14-inch guns adding their voices to the storm. From above, I imagined it must have looked like a wall of steel-breathing fire at a single black speck in the Pacific. Downrange, the island was disintegrating. The northern slopes where the Japanese had built their strongest defenses were now an open wound of craters, burning bunkers, and shattered steel. "Sir," Chen shouted over the roar, stopwatch in hand. 36 rounds fired from the main battery in 8 minutes. Keep counting, I told him. The Marines will want to know exactly what we flattened. As the barrage went on, something strange happened. The noise didn't dull, it deepened. It wasn't a single sound anymore, but layers, each gun with its own timbre, each blast a note in an orchestration of destruction, and beneath it all, the steady churn of the Pacific. I thought of the men on the island, not their faces, we would never see their faces, but their reality, their tunnels, their bunkers, their belief that they could hold. No bunker, no matter how strong, could survive what we were bringing. The smoke thickened with each minute. I could barely see the outline of the island now, but I didn't need to. The sound alone told the story. Then came the first sign they weren't dead yet. A high-pitched whistle cut through the air. A second later, a Japanese artillery shell splashed into the water 200 yards off our port bow, sending a column of white spray skyward. The crew froze for half a heartbeat. "Enemy shore battery has found our range," someone yelled through the intercom. Captain McCree didn't blink. "All guns, concentrate on that position." The Iowa pivoted with the grace of a monster, built for one purpose. 9 barrels shifted like the heads of a hydra finding its prey. "Fire!" The answer was instantaneous. 9 shells screamed toward the shore. A single, rolling boom swallowed the enemy gun. Through the smoke, the Japanese battery simply ceased to exist. No cheers, just silence for a breath. Then, the rhythm resumed. By midday, the entire island was being reshaped. Hills were leveled. Bunkers vanished. Valleys filled with debris. The landscape was turning into a moonscape of ash and fire. Rodriguez came to the bridge during a brief lull, his face streaked with powder. "Sir," he panted, "Turret 2's fired 42 shells. Ship's total over 100. I nodded and pointed toward the island. "Take a look and tell me if you think they were wasted." He raised a pair of binoculars, squinted into the haze, and let out a low whistle. "Looks like somebody dropped a sledgehammer on the whole island." I didn't tell him the truth out loud, that this was only the first of 3 days. As the afternoon wore on, fatigue set in, not from battle, but from relentless power. Guns this size don't just speak, they leave echoes in the air, in the chest, in the bones. The barrels glowed faintly red, like beasts panting after a hunt. Crews rotated, but the rhythm never faltered. I walked the deck past gun crews catching their breath for 30 seconds before the next shell. Their faces weren't jubilant. They were focused. They understood that precision here meant lives saved later. Downrange, Iwo Jima burned. Smoke rose in columns so dense they merged with the clouds. What had once been carefully camouflaged defensive positions were now scars on the black volcanic rock. "We're turning fortresses into craters," McCree said quietly beside me. "Yes, sir," I answered, "and we're just getting started." The captain gave a curt nod. He wasn't boasting. He was acknowledging the truth. The guns spoke again, and the island listened. The rhythm of the guns had become part of us. By the 3rd hour, the noise was no longer startling or thrilling. It was just there, a brutal heartbeat of steel that filled every space on the ship. Men moved through the smoke and vibration like dancers in a routine learned too well. The Iowa was alive, and its language was fire. I leaned on the bridge railing, squinting through the gray haze toward the island. Where there had once been ridgelines and bunkers, now only craters and fire pits remained. Each salvo had bitten another piece out of the enemy's fortress. The black volcanic earth rose in plumes and fell like ash-colored rain on the water. This was what power looked like, not sudden or glamorous, but steady, merciless, inevitable. Below decks, the gun crews had started their own quiet rituals between salvos. Rodriguez wiped his hands on a filthy rag and tapped the breech twice for luck. The loader next to him whispered the same short prayer before each shell went home. None of them were superstitious men before this war, but when you work next to the mouth of a thunder god, you start reaching for something that steadies your hands. I descended from the bridge for a closer look. Inside the turret compartments, the air was thick with burnt powder. Hot metal and human breath mingled until you could taste it. A shell handler, young as my nephew, was hunched over with sweat running down his face. He caught sight of me and straightened instantly. "You holding up, son?" I asked over the roar. "Yes, sir, just feels like the world's ending every 90 seconds. He wasn't wrong. Every blast shook the hull. Even the thickest steel couldn't hide you from that kind of power. The hydraulic rammer hissed, and another shell disappeared into the chamber like it had never existed as anything else. Breech locked. Ready light flicked green. A nod. A spark.
Fire.
The world jumped. By mid-afternoon, the island no longer resembled its own map. Spotter reports came in rapid bursts. Northern slope bunker cluster, destroyed.
Artillery nest, silent.
Tunnel mouth collapsed. But the enemy hadn't gone quiet everywhere. A second Japanese battery found our range and let loose. The first shell missed wide, hissing into the sea. The second landed closer. The third threw spray over the Iowa's forward deck, close enough to make my stomach tighten. Battery bearing 290, fire control called out. McCree didn't hesitate. All turrets concentrate fire, erase it. The ship turned slightly, every barrel tilted like a predator sniffing blood. The next salvo was not part of a rhythm, it was a punch. 9 shells in perfect unison screamed toward the enemy. A single blast swallowed the Japanese guns. When the smoke lifted, there was nothing left but a gouged hillside. No cheering, just silence for a breath, then back to work. Rodriguez stumbled up to the bridge later, face smeared with powder and fatigue. "Sir," he gasped, "turret 2's at 80 shells fired, whole ship's over 200. "Rest your crew when you can," I told him. He gave a tired half-grin. "Sir, we're good, just didn't think we'd be rewriting an island today." I handed him my binoculars. "Look." Through the drifting smoke, the northern beaches of Iwo Jima were unrecognizable. What had been concrete, gun emplacements, and fortified caves was now a landscape of broken teeth. Rodriguez lowered the binoculars slowly. "It looks like the moon." "Good," I said. "The Marines will prefer the moon." Up on the flag deck, Captain McCree gathered the senior officers. The sun was sinking lower, the light catching the smoke and turning it the color of bruised steel. "We've expended over 200 rounds this morning alone," McCree said, voice low but firm. "More than some entire battles in the last war." Anderson flipped open the latest aerial photographs. The Japanese tunnel system ran like veins through the island. Their guns, mounted on rails, could be shifted through hidden galleries, popping up to fire before vanishing again. This was why we hadn't silenced every weapon yet. "We keep hitting them until they stop moving," McCree said. No one argued. That afternoon brought a different kind of intensity. The firing pattern shifted, less blanket bombardment, more surgical destruction. We targeted command bunkers, ammo dumps, hidden artillery positions revealed when they dared fire back. The fleet moved like a machine, 8 battleships breathing in the same rhythm, exhaling flame. Each impact shook the ground miles away, but it also shook us. Power has weight. Even on the bridge, you could feel the air change with every salvo, pressing against your chest like an invisible hand. Below decks, loaders swapped shifts. Their shoulders were raw from lifting shells, their hands blackened, but the pace never slowed. Then came the silence. Not long, just long enough to notice. The main battery paused as the barrels cooled, glowing faintly after hours of fire. The ship felt empty without the thunder. I leaned over the rail and stared at the island. Smoke pillars rose into the twilight. For the first time that day, I could hear the ocean again, a soft, almost fragile sound against the violence we'd unleashed. A veteran chief named Sullivan joined me, 18 years in the Navy, Atlantic before Pacific. He'd seen U-boats go down and convoys burned, but even he stared at the burning island like it was something alien. "I've been in this Navy since 27, Sullivan said quietly. "I've never seen anything like this. We're not bombarding it, Commander, we're erasing it." He wasn't wrong. What lay out there wasn't a battlefield anymore. It was a wound carved into stone. When the guns resumed, the night sky was already deepening. Flame from the barrels lit the decks like orange lightning. The echo rolled out across the water, bouncing between ships like distant thunder. And still, somewhere beneath all that fire and ruin, we knew the Japanese were waiting. They'd spent months preparing for us. They wouldn't break in a single day, but the island itself was breaking around them. I closed my logbook that night and looked out at the orange glow on the horizon. That glow used to be a fortress. Rodriguez's earlier words drifted back to me. "We're rewriting an island." He didn't know how right he was. In a single day, we had reshaped a piece of the earth, turning stone into ash and bunkers into craters, and tomorrow we would do it again. Dawn came heavy on the second day. The sea was flat as hammered glass, the air carrying the sharp tang of burned powder and black sand. Smoke still hung low over Iwo Jima, a storm that refused to clear. The night hadn't brought silence. The bombardment had only paused long enough for barrels to cool, for men to eat cold food in silence, for a few weary souls to close their eyes with the sound of distant artillery still rolling in their ears. By the time the first gray streaks of morning bled into the horizon, the crews were already back at their stations. Turrets creaked like giants stretching their limbs after a restless sleep. The fire control teams recalculated targets based on fresh aerial reconnaissance. This was no blind hammering anymore. This was surgical destruction, aimed at the few fortifications that somehow still clung to life. From the bridge, I watched the spotter planes trace lazy circles over the island. Their voices came through the radio, calm, clipped, efficient. Iowa, this is Spotter 1. Enemy gun emplacement grid 2653. Minimal movement. Recommend strike. I didn't need to glance at McCree. The order was already forming in his eyes. Turret 2, I said into the handset. Ready on Spotter 1's mark. The barrels swung smoothly, already warm from the morning drills. Fire! The blast tore through the calm air. 25 seconds later, the island answered with a plume of black and red, another Japanese gun reduced to memory. The second day of fire had begun. If the first day was about shock and awe, the second was about method and pressure. The men no longer moved with the raw adrenaline of the opening salvo. Now, they worked with precision, every action sharpened by exhaustion but reinforced by discipline. Below decks, Rodriguez led his turret crew like a conductor. Powder bags, he barked. Watch your hands on the breech. His voice had grown hoarse, but the rhythm was smooth. They'd fired so many shells that their movements were instinct now. Steel in, fire out. Steel in, fire out. Up on the bridge, Captain McCree sipped black coffee that had gone cold an hour ago. His eyes never left the smoke-choked island. They're still in there, he muttered. They're buried deep. I nodded. They built a fortress underground, sir. We're peeling it one layer at a time. McCree gave a thin smile. Then we keep peeling. The fleet operated like a single machine. Iowa, Missouri, Wisconsin, and the older battleships took turns pounding specific sectors of the island. Spotter planes marked new positions. Destroyers circled the perimeter like wolves guarding a hunt. Every few hours, another hidden artillery nest would open fire on us, and every time it died before it could fire a second shot. But the Japanese were relentless. Even buried beneath a mountain of stone, they kept firing back small, defiant flashes through the smoke. It was enough to remind every man on the ship that this was no parade. There were soldiers down there, waiting for the real battle to begin. That afternoon, we received a visit. A launch ferried Admiral Turner across the waves, a tall, iron-voiced man who carried command like a second skin. His boots rang sharp on the deck as he climbed aboard the Iowa. Every man stiffened a little taller when he passed. He walked straight to the bridge, barely acknowledging the salute. Report, he said simply. McCree gestured to the charts. Day 2, sir. More than 400 shells fired from Iowa alone. Enemy coastal batteries largely neutralized. Remaining activity in the tunnel systems. Turner studied the aerial recon photos, the landscape now cratered beyond recognition. We'll be landing soon, he said. Every gun you silence is one less Marine we lose. I felt those words settle into the room like weight. Turner moved to the bridge wing, binoculars raised. I've seen a lot of bombardments, he said quietly, but this is something else. As the sun climbed, the fleet launched a coordinated strike unlike anything I'd ever witnessed. All battleships, all guns synchronized, one grid square at a time. The order moved like a wave through the task force. Iowa ready. Missouri ready. Wisconsin ready. All ships commence firing. The ocean didn't just echo, it roared. A rolling wall of flame leapt from every broadside in a single, thunderous moment. Even from the bridge, I felt the heat brush my face. Smoke consumed the horizon. 25 seconds later, Iwo Jima shook like it was trying to tear itself from the earth. Rodriguez's voice crackled through the intercom. Sir, we've never fired like this before. No, I answered, nobody has. Hours blurred together in the haze of fire and steel. Lunch came in cold tins. Conversations were short, practical. The crew had adapted to the thunder the way sailors adapt to waves. It didn't startle anymore. It inhabited them. Spotter reports came in like clockwork. Southwest sector bunker cluster eliminated. No movement at airfield. Secondary explosion, ammo dump confirmed. With each hit, the island's resistance faded, but it didn't vanish. You could still feel it, something beneath the rubble, like a heartbeat under bruised skin. Late in the day, as the light tilted gold across the water, a sudden burst of enemy counterbattery fire caught us by surprise. 3 shells streaked out from the island's southern ridge. The first fell short. The second threw a curtain of spray over Missouri's bow. The third smacked the sea off Iowa's starboard side, close enough to rattle the bridge windows. "Shore Battery, Grid 1935, came the call. McCree didn't flinch. "Return fire, all turrets." The Iowa responded like a living creature. The guns elevated, locked, and exhaled hell. 9 shells landed within a 50-yard spread. The enemy battery disappeared into the smoke. Turner lowered his binoculars, his jaw tight. "That's how you answer." As night approached, the bombardment slowed but never stopped. Smaller caliber guns from cruisers and destroyers took over some sectors while the battleships rotated crews. The ocean glimmered orange with each blast, as if the sea itself had caught fire. I stood at the bridge wing and watched the flames arc through the night sky. Each shell was a promise that we would not give the enemy 1 inch without a price. Sullivan, the old chief, appeared beside me, hands in his pockets. 3 days of this, he said softly. 3 days, I echoed. I've never seen an island take this much punishment. Neither have they, I replied. Turner departed as the stars came out, the last of the orange glow flickering over the horizon. Below, the turrets rested for the briefest of moments. Their steel mouths were blackened, their barrels warm like beasts after a long hunt. The men leaned against the bulkheads, exhausted but ready for the next order. And out there, beneath a mountain of shattered stone, the defenders of Iwo Jima still waited. They had chosen to fight to the end, so would we. As I wrote my log entry for the day, my pen hesitated over the page. How do you put into words something like this? It wasn't a battle. It wasn't even a fight yet. It was the crushing weight of inevitability. Tomorrow would be the last day of fire before the Marines landed. And when they went ashore, they'd walk on ground that no longer resembled anything human. The third morning arrived not with silence, but with a strange, heavy stillness. The guns had gone quiet just before dawn, and for the first time in 72 hours, the sea sounded like the sea again. But the quiet wasn't peace. It was the silence of a beast pausing to breathe before the last blow. I stepped onto the bridge and looked toward Iwo Jima. The island was gone in everything but name. What had once been a fortress of rock and concrete was now a landscape of shadows and smoke. The black volcanic sand was torn open in craters that overlapped like scales. Fortifications once considered impregnable were simply missing. Behind me, the Iowa's deck bore the marks of its own war. Scorched paint, smoke residue, shell grease worked deep into the steel. The men moved slower now, not because they were weak, but because 3 days of steel rain had burned the adrenaline out of them, leaving only focus. "Morning, Commander," Sullivan said, joining me at the rail. "Morning," I answered. We didn't need to say much. The air itself told the story. 700 hours, final fire plan, the last bombardment before the Marines landed. Captain McCree's voice came over the loudspeaker, calm, steady, like the tide. "All stations, final fire missions commencing. Let's finish the job." Turret crews, bruised and grimy, returned to their posts. Fire control recalibrated for targets that were barely even targets anymore. This wasn't bombardment now, it was sweeping rubble. The order came down. "Commence firing." The Iowa bellowed, so did Missouri, Wisconsin, and the old battleships. One more storm rolled over the Black Island. Shells punched into what remained of the defensive lines, collapsing tunnels, vaporizing machine gun nests, silencing whatever could still shoot back. Each impact wasn't triumph anymore. It was necessity. It was a final act of erasure. The spotter planes reported less this morning. There wasn't much left to report. Iowa Spotter 1, Southern Ridge Bunker, gone. Airfield sector clear, no visible movement. Tunnel entrances appear sealed. The Japanese defense was still there, buried deep in the labyrinth below the surface, but the face of their fortress was gone. We had ripped away their shield. Below decks, Rodriguez leaned against the turret bulkhead between salvos. His face looked 10 years older than it had 3 days ago. "Sir," he said through the intercom, "if there's anything left standing out there, it's not for lack of trying." "Then let's make sure they remember us," I answered. At 9:30, the guns ceased fire. A ripple of silence spread across the fleet. You could feel the collective breath being held. For the first time in 3 days, the sound of waves against the hull was louder than the roar of the guns. I lifted my binoculars. The island didn't even look like land anymore, just smoke, craters, fire. The terrain was unrecognizable from the map we'd studied. It wasn't a battlefield, it was a wound carved into the earth. And then the landing craft began to move. From the decks of 8 battleships, thousands of sailors watched as the Marines climbed into Higgins' boats, their helmets glinting under the pale sun. Wave after wave pushed off toward the black sand beaches. The men were quiet, not out of fear, out of respect. They were walking into what we had made. McCree stood beside me, hands folded behind his back. "This is where the history books will start," he said. I nodded, "and they'll skip everything that came before." Iwo Jima's beaches looked like the surface of the moon as the first landing craft touched sand. The echo of our bombardment still hung in the air, like distant thunder refusing to fade. Some Marines jumped into knee-deep water. Others charged across sand still warm from the fires. And then the enemy finally answered. Machine gun fire crackled from somewhere beneath the surface. Mortars whistled. Even after everything we'd thrown at them, the Japanese defenders were still there, buried deep, waiting. I felt a chill even as the sun rose higher. "They built this to blade us," Sullivan said quietly. "Yeah," I replied, "and we turned it into hell anyway." All morning the landing unfolded. Higgins' boats shuttled wave after wave. Some Marines crouched behind shell holes we had carved into the beach. Craters made by the Iowa's guns became their cover. I realized then just how much of this battle would depend on the foundation we'd created in steel and smoke. Rodriguez emerged from below decks to catch a glimpse. His hands were still streaked with soot. He watched in silence as the Marines advanced through the haze. "Hard to believe there's anyone alive down there," he muttered. "They're alive," I said. "They've been waiting for this." He lowered the binoculars. "Then God help those boys." By midday, the island looked less like a place and more like a memory. The Marines had secured parts of the beach, but the fight inland was brutal. From our distance, we could see smoke still curling upward from gun pits and tunnels that refused to die quietly. The Iowa didn't fire again that day. Our work was done. The thunder that had started at dawn 3 days ago had finished its song. All that was left now was the ground war. The deck crew gathered quietly by the rail, watching the smoke drift and the flag rise over the black sand. No shouting, no victory cheers, just tired men staring at the cost of what they'd helped create. That night, long after the last landing craft returned empty, I walked the deck alone. The Pacific stretched out black and endless. The sky above was cold and clear. The island was still burning. I thought about the first morning, about how it had looked like a fortress. Now it was ash. I thought about the men who would die down there, and the men who had made it home because we'd silenced the guns above them. It wasn't glory. It was weight, heavy, permanent weight. Captain McCree joined me at the starboard rail, hands tucked behind his back. "You know, Morrison," he said, 30 years from now, kids will read about the Marines raising the flag on that hill." "Mount Suribachi," I said softly. "Yeah, and they'll cheer, but they won't hear the guns. They won't smell the powder. They won't remember the island before we erased it." I stared at the orange glow still lingering over the horizon, but we will. The Iowa's guns were quiet now. The greatest bombardment we had ever unleashed had ended, but its echo lingered in the air, in the steel, in the bones of every man who stood on that deck. 3 days, 8 battleships, thousands of shells, an island rewritten. History would remember the flag, we would remember the fire.